The police and prisons kill us, the courts and inquests fail us, and politicians, allow it all to happen and then betray us when they're meant to represent us. We're the only ones who are really fighting for justice.
Mutual, la, mutual, la. This is the Mutual Broadcasting System.
Residents across Victoria and South Australia are being urged to remain vigilant as extreme fire conditions threaten both states.
Downgraded and lost cyclone status. 100-kilometre-an-hour winds have torn roofs off homes and intense rainfall has swamped the region.
G'day friends, and welcome to another episode of the Radio Reversal podcast. As always, we're recording this episode on the unceded lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people here in Mugginjin, so-called Brisbane. I'm Anna. I'm a white settler living uninvited on these lands, and as we so often do on Radio Reversal, what we're really grappling with this week is the continuing consequences of colonialism on this continent and across the world. We're coming back in this episode to one of the core themes that we've been exploring over the past couple of weeks here on the Radio Reversal podcast, which is this question of crisis. This is a really heavy episode because we're looking head on at the brutal reality of colonial violence and a whole bunch of different ways that settler colonial states use techniques of violence, repression, racism, surveillance, disappearance and dispossession, among others, as tools to manage their permanent crisis conditions. We're starting in this episode from the reminder that Indigenous peoples across the globe have never stopped resisting occupation or asserting their Indigenous sovereignty over their homelands. And this long history of resistance and steadfastness is what creates the permanent crisis conditions of colonialism. Settler colonies in particular are full of contradictions. They're built on a mythology of liberal freedom and, quote, civilization, and yet at every juncture they've relied on violence, repression and dispossession in order to be maintained. We see from this continent to global contexts that the continuing presence and sovereignty of Indigenous peoples proves to be an irresolvable contradiction for colonies that have been legitimised through myths like, here in so-called Australia, the notion of terra nullius, a land belonging to no one, or in Palestine, the eerily similar Zionist mythology of a land without a people for a people without a land. So it's pretty clear that Indigenous people represent a profound threat to the stability and legitimacy of settler colonial states. And this week we're looking at some devastating examples of the lengths that settler colonies will go to remove this threat. We're starting this week's episode by returning to this year's commemoration of the 76th anniversary of the Palestinian Nakba, or catastrophe, which marks the formation of the State of Israel through the mass ethnic cleansing and dispossession of Palestinian people from their lands. To get across the events of the Nakba and the way they echo through to the present, we're sharing an interview recorded by Radio Reverser Han with our dear friend and intellectual guiding light in so many things, Dr. Jamal Nabulsi, who provides some crucial historical and political context for the Nakba and what it means to mark this anniversary in the context of the continuing atrocities in Gaza. We then turn to two speeches from the recent Nakba commemoration here in Mugginjin from diaspora Palestinian organiser and activist Rima Naji and from very staunch comrade and community organiser Benil Mohideen. In the second part of this episode, we're turning back towards this continent to think, I guess, about the significance of commemorating the 76th anniversary of the Zionist occupation of Palestine from the vantage point of 237 years of ongoing colonial occupation of this continent. To help us see the linkages between colonialism in Palestine and here, we're turning, as we so often do, to Dhirrumbal and South Sea Islander writer and academic Dr. Amy McGuire. We're very excited to be sharing a kind of little sneak peek from some opening remarks that Amy provided on the plenary panel discussion for the Activism for Palestine conference, which was hosted by Justice for Palestine Mugginjin over the weekend. We were lucky enough to head along and record a couple of the conversations that happened as part of that conference to share with anyone who couldn't attend in person. And we'll be packaging those up and releasing them in the next couple of weeks. But for now, though, we wanted to share this small excerpt because, as Amy explains in this speech, The connections between Indigenous people globally form a rich ecosystem with roots that intertwine across the globe. Colonial, capitalist, patriarchal states try to prune this unruly mass, weeding out dissent and resistance wherever they find it. And our work as activists, Amy reminds us, is not to try and cultivate or control or regulate this vast ecosystem, not to treat ourselves as gardeners, but rather to understand ourselves as part of it, to allow ourselves and our struggles to grow and flourish together.
Jamal, before we jump too far into our conversation, just in case we have any listeners who haven't met you before, could you first please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, sure. I'm an organiser, a writer, a researcher, an educator, and a lot of the work that I do concerns really both enacting and theorising Palestinian resistance, as well as dissecting colonial structures that we resist, including Zionist settler colonialism, but also settler colonialism here in so-called Australia, and more broadly understanding settler colonialism as a global structure that's not restricted to any one specific land, but is sort of intricately connected to colonising multiple Indigenous lands sort of simultaneously. Yeah, I've written specifically about the Nakba before as well, and among many other topics.
First, let's dig in a little bit to Nakba, the catastrophe. I wonder if you could give us a bit of background. It's usually correlated with the genocide and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their homelands during the formation of the State of Israel in 1948. But I'm wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on the context for that particular series of events and what kinds of colonial and imperial violences were taking place in Palestine, even leading up to that time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as you said, the Nakba, it's Arabic word for catastrophe. It's, the great catastrophe for the Palestinian people. It's often used, as you said, to refer specifically to the events of 1947-48, when Zionist militias ethnically cleansed around 780,000 Palestinians from their homes in Palestine and completely destroyed over 400 Palestinian towns and villages, just completely wiped them off the map, and then founded the State of Israel over the top of the ruins of these places, stealing these people's homes and not allowing them to return to them to this day as well. Palestinians are not allowed to return to those homes. But of course, it's crucial to recognize that this event that we describe as the Nakba did not really begin in 1947 or 1948, because, first of all, the Zionist militias had been planning very meticulously in detail this ethnic cleansing project for years before. And this is all documented. I mean, you can go and read these plans if you want. It wasn't some, spontaneous kind of event, as it's often portrayed by, I think many Zionists deny that it happened at all. Some liberal Zionists would kind of accept that it happened, but, say there's nothing that we can do about it now or something like that.
Sounds familiar in this place. Yeah.
Exactly. And they would have you believe that these were kind of unfortunate, almost inevitable events that happen in wars. But in reality, this ethnic cleansing campaign was very much planned. It was planned specifically in the years prior, but it was planned in more general terms for decades prior. Once the Zionist movement set its sights on Palestine as its target for colonization, because prior to that, they had considered other land. They had considered colonizing other lands, including Uganda, Argentina, even parts of so-called Australia. And yeah, I think it's also a crucial part of the context here as well is British colonialism in the region. I mean, British and French in the region, but specifically, very direct role from the British in ushering in the ethnic cleansing of the Nakba, because Palestine was under a colonial mandate of the British at the time, who essentially facilitated Zionist colonization in Palestine, as well as kind of employing their own means of colonizing the land. So there was a sort of, in the couple of decades leading up to 1948, there was really a kind of dual colonialism of Palestine from the British and the Zionist movement. And they were supporting each other as well. They had tensions at times between one another, but at the end of the day, ultimately, they were supporting one another. They were supporting one another's colonial projects, specifically in dispossessing Palestinians of their land.
Yeah, and this is, to just dig into that ever so slightly more, this is sort of interesting and relevant. Australia, as the settler colonial state, and its rulers tend to want to distance ourselves from the ongoing conflict today, but also the history of the formation of the state of Israel, but have been kind of implicated since the beginning as kind of allies of the British in that region. So I wonder if you have anything to mention about Australians' part in sort of the lead up to the Nakba.
Yeah. The Australian government actually played a very direct role in bringing in the Nakba, actually. Not only through that kind of broader alliance with the British, but so essentially there are two key catalysts to this ethnic cleansing of the Nakba. Of course, I mentioned that it was planned meticulously before it was executed. So, these Zionist militias, they were ready to do it, but they needed the conditions in order to execute those plans. And two crucial things allowed for them to do that. One is the withdrawal of the British, who, even though they were colonizing the land and arming the Zionist movement actively while disarming the Palestinian national movement, kind of deconstructing the Palestinian national movement very actively, they were also, to some extent, what was standing in the way between the Zionist militias carrying out, the full-scale ethnic cleansing. And they, could have predicted very easily because they knew what was going to happen when they withdrew, and they withdrew very suddenly. They handed essentially the entire structure of the state over to the Zionist movement, and so they very actively facilitated that ethnic cleansing. So that's one of the two key catalysts. The second is the UN partition plan issued in 1947. The UN basically, against the protests of many of the Arab states at the time who were far more supportive of Palestine than the vast majority of them now are deeply complicit in the colonization of Palestine. But at the time, and also related to their own interests as well, were protesting the foundation of a Zionist state in Palestine. And that's what the UN partition plan essentially proposed, to found a Zionist state over part of Palestine and to fragment the land of Palestine. Now, the role of Australia. The chair of the UN committee that recommended the partition plan was Doc Evatt, who's a very famous Australian politician. He's kind of lauded in Australian history. He was, a key leader in the Labor Party. So I think we should also recognise that the Labor Party itself has long been complicit in the colonisation of Palestine. And, is kind of lauded as this sort of founding figure in Australian history. He's got a suburb named after him in Canberra. I'm sure he's got plenty of things named after him, to be honest. And he was the chair of this committee. And essentially, he was a Zionist himself, which tracks with his broader sort of political position, because he also supported the White Australia policy. This is someone who was very actively supporting racist colonial projects and ideas. He essentially, after sort of heavy lobbying from Zionist lobby groups.
Yeah, which existed even then, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Eventually decided to dismiss the concerns and protests of many states, not only Arab states as well. They were kind of leading it, but there was many other states who were also deeply troubled by this, colonization of Palestinian land, and aside with the imperial powers, and proposed this partition plan, which then essentially gave the Zionist militias a kind of, international cover or international complicity for them to go ahead and, execute the plans. I think it's also important to stress that in claiming that Zionism was always a colonial project, these are their own words, by the way. They very actively, very explicitly said this. The founders of Zionism and the, subsequent leaders of Zionism were very open about this fact, stating very plainly that Zionism is a colonial project. We're going to colonize Palestine, or, they were talking about colonizing other lands, as I mentioned earlier, eventually settled on Palestine. So I think it really makes mockery of the, the claims, Zionists try and distance themselves from these things, this kind of discourse today, and, claim to be indigenous to the land and that kind of thing. But in reality, it was always very explicitly a colonial project.
Absolutely. Yeah, the using of biblical references and things to lay claim to the land is is kind of applied over the top of what was explicitly a colonial project.
Yeah, exactly. Those kind of like religious, mythological justifications were always alongside like the more kind of standard colonial justifications. You know, like there's the myth that Palestine was a land without people for a people without land, for example. I mean, this exactly mirrors the idea of terra nullius that was used to colonize, this place. Or, the founder of the Zionist organization, Theodor Herzl, like he claimed that the Zionist state would be like a portion of the rampart of Europe against Asia and like an outpost of civilization opposed to barbarism. So this is just like really, it's just straight out of the kind of colonial discourse.
Deeply Orientalist ideologies and
And we see exactly the same discourse as well being parroted by like, the Zionist leaders today, like Netanyahu, has said something very similar, like it's the children of light versus the children of darkness or whatever it is. And it's like, there's these kind of biblical references, but they're also colonial. And it's that mixture of the two discourses.
Which, especially European imperialism and colonialism has always used religious justification, which is pretty twisted from the teachings as they often are sort of presented within both Christianity and Judaism to kind of reinforce these projects of violence and power and domination and ethnic cleansing. Before
it's like the manifest destiny of, that justification that they use to colonize Turtle Island.
Would you talk about the sort of significance of marking this point, of marking the Nakba and the ongoing kind of commemorations, and maybe a little bit the difference between sort of community-led commemorations like this and the role that plays during ongoing violence like what is happening today, as opposed to sort of more official kind of military commemorations? I'm thinking of Anzac Day as that's celebrated here in the settler colonial state of Australia.
Yeah, we've been protesting to mark the Nakba every year here in Meganjin specifically for many, many years now. And of course, globally for much longer as well. But I think it's particularly important to come out now in the context of, what's described as this kind of new Nakba, the genocide in Gaza, as well as the escalating ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, among these sort of many attempts by Israel to eliminate the Palestinian people from the land of Palestine, because Israel is now using starvation as one of its key weapons, designed to murder tens of thousands of children and adults through starvation. It's been using starvation as a weapon from the beginning of the genocide, as well as before that, from the start of the siege on Gaza some, 17, 18 years ago. But they've been emboldened by the silence and complicity internationally with this genocide. And now they can just very openly, starve Palestinians to death. We're standing up and saying we will never be silent when children are being deliberately starved to death, which, when you say it out loud, it sounds pretty basic. I think to come to the question about, these different commemorations, I think it's important that we reflect on what events are commemorated, what events are not commemorated, what is kind of highlighted in those commemorations, who's sort of erased in those commemorations, these kind of questions, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. The kind of role of monuments and commemorations and kind of thinking the sort of public knowledge of history, the practice of public memory, from everything, as you say, like suburbs named after politicians or various forces in initial invasions and settlements that, mark across this continent, but also the practices of renaming and like wiping out histories that's particularly happened across Israel and occupied Palestine, to sort of rewrite the history, something we often call whitewashing, that seeks to not kind of keep markings of things in public memory. And this is maybe a point to start to talk a bit about solidarity between Palestinian diaspora in this place and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, with the increased commemorations of some of the battles of the frontier wars and things across this nation that, are starting to like put that history back into its proper place. Nakba Day has a long tradition of kind of being amongst those sort of markings. Could you speak a bit to some of the solidarity work being done with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander activists?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, first of all, this great resource for listeners to go and access to learn about this solidarity work is blackpal.com. And so, maybe we can put the link in the show notes.
100%.
And there's loads of resources there, not only writing, but there's lots of different videos, like short films and videos of actions and descriptions of actions and artwork and just, all sorts of different things in lots of different forms. Absolutely go and check that out, as I think that's got a whole lot more information that I can kind of give you immediately. This solidarity, both the Black Palestinian solidarity specifically and these kind of Indigenous solidarities more generally, I think they're absolutely crucial because settler colonialism is a global structure, and part of how that structure functions is to divide Indigenous struggles from one another. It tries to fragment Indigenous kind of peoples and lands and homes and selves and communities within each colony, but it also does that across colonies as well. So fragmenting us from one another. Part of resisting that and part of strengthening one another's movements, of course, is standing in solidarity. And I think this is both important in a practical sense, in that we're stronger when we stand together. And it's also important in a kind of knowledge and what we can kind of learn and see, because we do have different experiences of colonization. Even though there's, of course, very fundamental similarities, we do have different experiences of the ways that settler colonies try to eliminate Indigenous peoples. We have different standpoints in relation to those colonies or to multiple colonies. Sort of in the case of Palestinians here, for example, where, we're Indigenous to Palestine, but then we're also settlers here. Part of what we do is trying to figure out what that means, what sort of responsibilities that it entails. But from these different kind of perspectives, these different standpoints, we see different things and we know different things about how colonies work. And we can teach one another about those things. We can learn from one another. And so, it helps us understand and dissect the settler colony so that we can resist it better, which then, also feeds back into the practical element of being stronger if we stand together.
I am wondering if you could talk a little bit. We've sort of touched on a few aspects of, where things are at right now. I'm sure most listeners are aware of the kind of re-worsening, I'm trying to think of a better word, but a bit brain foggy, of Israel's acute genocidal campaign in Gaza and across also the West Bank, as well as there's been violence, of course, in Lebanon, Yemen, Syria's Golan Heights and beyond that's continued over the past 18 months. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts to share on where things are at in this moment.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of over the last year and a half or more since this genocide began, I always think this is as bad as it can possibly be. And then, somehow it gets worse or, Israel makes it worse. It doesn't just get worse. And I think we're in an incredibly dire situation now. I spoke about the active starvation really being escalated now, which it's devastating. But also, people should be incredibly worried about this. Also on a global scale, because if a state can get away with deliberately starving people, it's of course it's not the first time that it happened. But if they can get away with it out in the open like this, along with all of the other things that they're doing, including the torture camps, obviously all of the bombing and, the list just goes on, then there's no reason why, another imperial power could do this to anyone else, including us here. And so, I think people should be incredibly concerned about that. But I think what's also deeply concerning is the silence. People have been kind of desensitized, I think, to Palestinian death and to Palestinian suffering. And that in itself, I think is devastating, but it also allows for the violence to continue and escalate. I think it's important to recognize that we here as well, us and our government, like, supposedly our government, the Australian government here, is very actively complicit in this genocide. They are supplying weapons to Israel to carry out these bombing campaigns, and we have a responsibility to resist that.
That was Dr. Jamal Nabulsi speaking with Han earlier this month. We're going to go now to two short speeches from this year's Nakba commemoration here in Mugginjan, so-called Brisbane. First up, this is Rima Naji.
To the Palestinian community with us today, I see you, and I know the weight you're carrying. How are we supposed to commemorate a catastrophe that we're still living? How are we supposed to mourn something that is ongoing? What we have right now is a second Nakba, more brutal than the first one. And for those of you who don't know, this is not just in Gaza. In West Bank, Israel has put up signs and billboards that say there's no future in Palestine, while displaying images of our people, our families being ethnically cleansed. Yes, shame. And the message is clear. They want to erase us and erase Palestine. And this is the cost of indifference. Between the lies of our political establishment and the cowardice of our journalists, Gaza has turned into rubble, and tens of thousands of Palestinians have been massacred. I mean, the Labour Party is still lying and denying any weapons exports to Israel. Across this country, there are numerous companies manufacturing weapons parts, exporting them, and those parts are being assembled into the F-35 fighter jets, the same machine used to turn families in Gaza into ashes. And where are the journalists? Where are they? To ask this simple question, what are weapons made of? Because weapons don't just fall from the sky, and genocide does not happen in a vacuum. Australia is complicit. It is deeply complicit in this genocide, from the sharing of military intelligence through Pine Gap to the exporting of weapons parts and coal that literally fuels a genocide, to the refusal of imposing even the most symbolic consequences like expelling the Israeli ambassador. I mean, how is this genocide supposed to end? How is it supposed to end when no one's taken responsibility? And do not take that answer from our politicians when they say there is nothing we can do about it because this is green light for genocide. This is green light for genocide. This is not neutrality. When people are not taking responsibility for our part in this genocide and what's happening right now, in the journalists who are not asking the most crucial questions in the most important moment in our history, they are also complicit in genocide. And we're not taking this for an answer. And I used to say that our politicians are out of touch with community. It is even worse. They're out of touch with humanity. And we're going to have to put pressure on them. All of us will have to put pressure on them. Because you know what? Over the years of commemorating Nakba, year after year, we have shared stories endlessly. The problem is, those stories are not over and done with. They are not. We are living them right now because Israel has turned our past into a living present. That does not pass. And what we're going to do about it? Are we just going to sit idly and watch the world as it commits genocide? I say the world because this is not just Israel. Israel does not act on its own. It is the backing of the international community and our politicians. And for those of you here, if you're here with a heavy heart, you should be proud of yourself, because there are many people who walk this earth with cold hearts, unable or maybe unwilling to look past their comfort. But your hearts are alive. And this is what we need to keep the streets alive and loud with our voices, with our rage and our hope.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يأمرون بالمعروف وينهون عن المنكر. You enjoin which is good and you guide society away from evil. This is a key concept in my tradition. It emphasizes that there is a collective responsibility on humankind to build moral societies that are based on truth and justice. And if we were to break down the process of building such societies, we would have three phases or three stages. You identify the unjust structures, you dismantle those unjust structures, and you reconstruct just structures in their place. The first phase asks of us to do an analysis of the darkness of today, this colonial structure, how it works, how it hurts. You see, at the top layer is an unholy collaboration of a racist media landscape, a compromised economic structure, and a complicit political structure. A system with elected leaders who have sold their souls to the merchants of death. A system that has billion-dollar blood-soaked contracts with the military-industrial complex, this never-ending war machine that thrives on manufacturing elements of mass destruction, these tools of abomination, the sole purpose of which are to seek, search, and destroy humanity. A system that freely labels Palestinians certain terms like animals, terrorists, extremists, criminals, radicals, while at the same time denies them the terms like genocide, massacres, murder, innocent civilians, and even the word children, because somehow in Palestine there are no children. A system that even after a 77-year-long documented Nakba, this catastrophe, the ethnic cleansings, countless massacres, after 19 months of barbaric live-streamed war crimes, will continue to repeat the blatant lie that the colonizer, the illegal occupier, the terrorizer, the violent perpetuator, the aggressor has the right to defend itself. Shame on it, shame. Yet somehow indigenous Palestinians, the victims of this genocide, the ones who are being oppressed, the innocent civilians upon whom this unimaginable pain has been inflicted for 77 years, are not only denied the right to defend themselves, but their recognition, their very existence is denied. Shame on them, shame. It is a system that is designed to keep us broken, to keep us divided, to keep us blind, while they profiteer from this perpetual state of genocides. And Palestine, at the center of this anti-colonial movement, has exposed a bare, naked Zionism in all its genocidal colonial shame. Zionism will never redeem itself. Civil rights activist and anti-Zionist Kwame Ture says, people mobilize around issues, but revolutionaries organize against unjust systems. They replace unjust systems with just systems. And that brings us to the next phase of this movement, where we organize to dismantle, to disassemble, to deconstruct these unjust structures. You see, for decades we have rallied and marched, mobilized in the streets, but that was not enough to see the genocidal boots off the necks of our brothers and sisters in Palestine. So we organized ourselves in direct action. It meant shutting down weapons manufacturers, boycotting Zionist corporations. It meant the encampments. It meant our lawyers taking politicians to court. It meant our healthcare workers healing under the bombs. It meant vigils in the streets. And if you have read the news lately, it meant taking Free Palestine into electoral politics for the very first time. By mobilizing, by organizing, by disrupting, by making things uneasy for those who exploit, we are opening the possibilities for the world to intervene. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. But this phase that we find ourselves in is the most difficult phase. It is in the nature of the colonial entity to respond with the exemplary brutality that we are witnessing today, to humiliate the resistance, to crush our voices. But this should not be the moment that we break. As the bombs continue to rain, as 2 million Palestinians continue to be starved, as 1.1 million children are being slowly decimated, as we read their heartbreaking goodbyes, we must throw ourselves and everything we have at every layer of this genocidal structure. As heartbroken as we are, this should be the moment of hope. And as a vision of a revolutionary future something for you and I to hold on to, I want you to imagine the beautiful next phase of this movement, where with the very hands we dismantle the unjust structures, we will reconstruct just structures, create societies, the building blocks of which are kindness, compassion, and empathy. A world that is free from weapons that murder children, free from the apartheid walls, free from bombs that fall and white phosphorus that burns, free from weaponized starvation, free from all forms of oppression and racism. And it is at that moment, at that very moment, that you and I, we become true revolutionaries. And inshallah, when that happens, and if I was still alive, it will be my honor, my privilege to build such just societies standing shoulder to shoulder with you. My brothers, my sisters, do not let this anger consume you. Let your rage, your sorrow guide you. Allow it to fuel this movement. Remember, the resistance is rooted in a deep connection, a love for its homeland. Revolutions are born from camaraderie, this community, this solidarity. Liberation is never given. It is to be taken by removing the injustices. And true freedom comes when our collective humanity creates just societies. This colonial machine, it demonized and it dehumanized. The biggest mistake they made, they labeled us radicals. We now make ourselves revolutionaries. From the river to the sea, free Palestine by any means necessary. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you all and strengthen your determinations, peace and power.
That was Benil Mohideen speaking at the Justice for Palestine Mparrtwe commemoration of the Nakba in May this year. To help link these conversations to the present moment, we're going to go now to an excerpt from the opening plenary panel of the Activism for Palestine conference that was held here in Mparrtwe last weekend. This is Darumbal and South Sea Islander scholar and award-winning writer, Dr. Amy McQuire.
Last year I had the opportunity to go to Dene Land up in Canada off Yellowknife with a group of Indigenous people from all around the world, and there were about 3 or 4 Palestinians there. And we spent time on the lake, doing medicine walks, learning from elders, listening to all of these stories. And I remember right at the end around the fire we were always all sharing, and one of the Palestinian fellows who were there, who was an architect, who was from Jerusalem, he said something about it was so important for him to be there because it was a reminder that there's life after genocide. And I think that's the power of particularly Black Palestinian solidarity and praxis, because when you're around black fellows over here, you see there is life after genocide. So it's 602 days into the Gaza genocide and 77 years since the Nakba, the great catastrophe. It's over 200 years since the brutal invasions of Aboriginal nations across the colony. It's only 2 days since a Walpiri man was killed in a supermarket by off-duty plainclothes police officers. Every day in Gaza has been a massacre, a killing, another act of outright brutal colonial violence that has now stained humanity. Every day we bear witness to displays of violence that feel incomprehensible. Thank you so much for the organisers for inviting me on this panel tonight, and thank you so much for the work that Justice for Palestine Mparrtwe has already done over the past few years. And that's what I wanted to talk to you a bit tonight about, how unique and powerful political formation that is Black Palestinian solidarity, which I really feel has been exemplified by Brisbane Blacks and Justice for Palestine Mparrtwe. So I wrote this short piece this morning while sitting across from the Royal Botanical Gardens in Brisbane at the offices of QUT's Karumba Institute. And I've been thinking a lot about the spaces we walk in, the spaces all around us, and how we move through these spaces. And the specific space of a park or a garden, which seems so beautiful and so innocent, so serene, is actually really deceptive. Because parks in this colony of Queensland actually represent a brutal violence, a replanting of the settler colony over the landscape that our ancestors cultivated and lived on for thousands and thousands of years. And it's this process of gardening that I think about in my work on disappearance, particularly in Queensland, because a process of gardening always involves a process of freeing the space. And this process is weeding, the eliminating of those bodies who are not welcome in these spaces. And this process is always seen as in the pursuit of a good cause, and it's always routine and it's always normalised. And the weeding is seen as essential to the cultivation of this space. So I've actually been reading about gardens and parks, and every park that I'm in, I like to read about the history. And last week, I think, I was reading about this beautiful garden up in Caboolture during colonial times. It was one of the most beautiful gardens in Queensland. And then I read that the owner was the director of the Mount Morgan mines. And I don't know if you know where Mount Morgan is, but it's just near Rockhampton. It's in the home of the Gungaloo people. And so as I was reading about this mine, it said that at one point it was the largest gold mine in the whole of the world. And that led me into a whole other rabbit hole. By 1907, the mine had produced $60 million worth of gold. And one of the original owners of that mine and the largest shareholder, who was made enormously rich on the stolen resources of the Gungaloo people, was a man named William Darcy, who used some of that money to invest in the oil fields in Persia, where his company was called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, and they struck oil in 1908. So why am I telling you this story? Because that Anglo-Persian oil company later became a company by the name of British Petroleum, which we now know today as BP. And so one of the first things I did after that was Google the words BP in Israel. And as many of you know, BP are responsible for about a pipeline that supplies about 28% of Israel's crude oil imports, the oil that's been used in fueling Israel's military operations, and this oil is sent through this pipeline to produce jet fuel for the F-35 planes that are dropping bombs on the children of Gaza. And not only that, BP also obviously operates in West Papua, where it's involved with all these gas fields, where there's excessive surveillance and violence enacted on West Papuan people. So the genocide of the Gungaloo and the First Nation tribes in Queensland, because the gold mine actually brought in waves of settlers into Darumba lands as well, is intrinsically connected to the current day atrocities in Gaza and in West Papua. And it's not just these extractive and exploitative industries, this outright greed and wealth and forces of environmental destruction that are connected to each other, but also they've benefited enormously from these connections. And if we wonder why some people can look at these images of horror and terror enacted upon the bodies of Palestinian people and seem so comfortable with it, it's because they look with their eyes blinded by their own wealth and their own greed. Their version of humanity is tied to the pursuit of profit. Their version of humanity is a process of gardening or cultivating of space in which Palestinians, West Papuans and Indigenous people are made to disappear, or as we know, which happened in this country, are made to become less human, as we were seen as flora and fauna. But in thinking about these connections of imperialism and greed, I also thought about what these connections tell us about how and why we fight for Palestine and West Papua. We fight because not only are these colonial violences connected, and not just in the past, but very much in the present, but also because our connections as Indigenous peoples are much more powerful than any connections that they have. If their networks of violence and greed are connected, then the opportunity to rupture these connections in one part of the world means a huge blow for imperialism everywhere, which is why solidarity in the building and grounding of these connections is so threatening to them. It's why we see such the silencing of both Palestinian and black voices. We see the silencing of voices like Randa Abdel Fattah and Chelsea Wadiko, because that becomes innately threatening to them. In the face of their bombs, we have little but our voices, and yet these voices are such a threat that there are these enormous campaigns and investments to silence them, and this speaks to the very heart of what we fight for, our shared humanity. Because settler colonialism ties to capitalism, you have to look at where they spend their money on. And the other thing I wanted to talk about is the pervasiveness of black Zionism, how we are seeing certain elements used against blackfellas in this country who stand up for Palestine, the fact that so many resources are going to silencing dissent, particularly in rupturing the connections of black Palestinian solidarity. They have spent a lot of money on this. I was thinking about Nova Paris, I was thinking about Marcia Langton, I was thinking about Sean Gordon, I was thinking about Warren Mundine. They have all gone on trips to Israel since the Gaza genocide began. They are not paying for those trips themselves. So you think the pursuit of profit is so important that they will support a genocide? You think about where the resources are going to silence dissent. It's always to break these connections that we're having here. It's always to break the connections that begin with black Palestinian solidarity. And I think what I wanted to talk to tonight, the connections of imperialism, of greed, of profit, of violence, of settler colonialism, they're all connected to each other. But we're also connected. And I think that's what we have to remember as well. And it seems like such a small thing in the face of the brutality and what is currently happening. But we remind each other not just of our shared humanity, But in our own experiences, we remind each other that there is always life after genocide. And that's why we come together. That's why Black Palestinian solidarity is innately threatening. They're placing their resources to trying to break it. We have to continue to solidify it. And that's through the fights not only in Palestine, but against extractive industries over here. So if you think about the Gomeroi people who are fighting Santos, you think about Walgan and Juggalo who are fighting Adani, thinking about the mob over in the Mparrtwe Peninsula. They're fighting these things. If we fight these things on our own country, we take one blow, we have a win over in Palestine as well. When Palestine is liberated, we have a win over here as well. It's because they're all connected. If we fight here, if we rupture that connection here, we win in Palestine as well. When Palestine is liberated, we win over here as well. And I think that's what we have to remember. It's not just a soul fight. It's a fight for humanity. It's a fight against extractivism. It's a fight against capitalism. It's a fight to remember what humanity actually means. And I think that's why it's so crucial, and Palestine has really shown us that.
We've been reminded of these deep connections this week in a particularly devastating way. Almost 5 years to the day after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020, many of us here in so-called Australia heard the tragic news that a young Walpiri man from the community of Yuendumu had been killed in an interaction with off-duty police officers in a supermarket in Mparrtwe, Alice Springs. Kumanjayi White was a vulnerable young man who is mourned by his family and community. He died after being restrained by off-duty police officers in an interaction that is disturbingly similar to the interaction that led to the murder of George Floyd. The police officers who restrained him have, incredibly, yet to be stood down by the NT police, and no announcements have been made regarding an inquiry into his death. All across the continent, communities have been mobilising to demand that the institutions and individuals who are responsible for his death face the accountability that they deserve. Kumanjayi White's family, including his grandfather, the venerable elder and activist Uncle Ned Hardgraves, have renewed their calls to disarm police across the Northern Territory. Almost 4 years ago, the Yuendumu community began the Karanjala Murajari campaign to demand a police ceasefire across the Northern Territory in response to the fatal shooting of Kumanjayi Walker by Constable Zachary Rolfe in 2019. They wrote, and I quote, "We do not want any more reports or inquiries that are not acted on. We already hold the answers and strategies we need. We do not want any more consultations with governments who do not listen to us. We demand our self-determination, our rightful decision-making authority, and our resources to be restored to us. This is a list of our demands. What we are calling for is Karanjala Murajari, a police ceasefire, indefinitely." To get across this ongoing campaign to disarm, defund and dismantle the police across the continent, in the last part of this week's episode, I'm catching up with Wanjirabara and Birragubba activist and filmmaker Sam Watson to talk about some of the demands made by Kumanjayi White's family and how communities across the country are mobilising in response to his death.
I've been involved in organising protests against racism and for refugee rights, protests on Invasion Day, Palestine solidarity, all kinds of things. Yeah, but particularly I've organised a lot of protests against deaths in custody in Brisbane, alongside groups like War and Brisbane Aboriginal Sovereign Embassy.
And unfortunately, that's the context in which we're having a conversation today. Some listeners might already know that there has been another Aboriginal death in custody. The family of Kumanjayi White and the community of Yuendumu in the Northern Territory are grieving this week. Can you, for listeners who haven't heard much about what's happened, can you talk just a little bit about the events that kind of unfolded last week and I guess the community's response so far?
It's completely devastating what happened last week. Kumanjayi White is a 24-year-old Walpiri Aboriginal man living in Alice Springs. He was living away from his community because he had a disability and needed extra support. And last week he was in Coles, and security guard stopped him, and an off-duty police officer who was in the Coles restrained him. Yeah, until that police officer, through restraining him, took his life. He was the grandson of Ned Hargraves. Ned Hargraves has been, Uncle Ned has been a staunch campaigner for the last 5 or 6 years, fighting to get guns out of remote communities. Now, that was in response to the murder of Kumanjayi Walker at the hands of another Northern Territory police officer. And this death in custody this week is only 6 years on from the murder of Kumanjayi Walker. So I can't even imagine how devastating it is for the community that they're both from, Yundamu, and for the Walpiri community. And I think for the wider Aboriginal community, when a death in custody happens, I think that it touches Aboriginal people right across this continent, because we've all had those interactions with police. We've all had family members or community members who've been killed in custody. We've all experienced the racism that is so present throughout society. It's devastating and just infuriating that it keeps happening.
Absolutely. And I mean, we know that the inquest into the death in custody of Kumanjayi Walker is still ongoing 6 years later. There's been a series of largely unsuccessful attempts to get legal accountability for his death. And the community have continued, and his family, who love and miss him, have continued fighting, through whatever mechanisms they can for some semblance of justice. But so to have another member of their family killed in these circumstances while the inquest is ongoing is just harrowing.
Yeah, obviously we are echoing Kumanjayi White's family and community's demands for accountability, for an independent investigation, for transparency about what happened. And I think that it's really important because when an Aboriginal person is killed in custody, it is the extreme of racism. But this occurrence is something that only happens in a wider context of racism and oppression of Aboriginal people. And what I see is that this oppression is really practiced for everyone else. When they kill Aboriginal people and they get away with it, when they over-police Aboriginal communities and they get away with it, when Aboriginal people are incarcerated at a rate of 12 times higher than the non-Indigenous population and no one does anything about it, that affects everyone. So I think because it is something that ultimately does affect us all, but it's also one of the, I keep coming back to this word devastating. It really is devastating what's happened. And I think that it should be, a galvanizing moment for people who care about Aboriginal rights, who care about human rights, and people should come out.
And I'm reminded, as you mentioned, Uncle Ned Hargraves, who's Kumanjayi White's grandfather and a really staunch leader from the Yuendamu community, the phrase that they've been using for the last 6 years is "we demand a ceasefire," and the echoes of that demand in the context of the ongoing genocide in Palestine and the very clear linkages that we can see right now between the ongoing genocidal intent of the colonial state here and in the actions of the Israeli state in Palestine. It couldn't be laid more bare, right?
I reflect on my own history of going to deaths in custody rallies. I remember back in 2004, 2005, the rallies that were happening when I was a kid for Murunji Dumaji. I remember when I started going to rallies as a young adult in 2016, and I remember there being a lot more rallies, and I think that when there was more rallies, it was harder for people to ignore what was happening. I think the power of rallies is that they can't just ignore it. And the situation is as bad as ever. The Queensland government, is just chomping at the bit to lock up more kids. The response from, the state to Kumanjayi White's murder has been to smear him in the media and, deny the possibility of an independent investigation. And I think that what we need is a revival of taking to the streets to demand justice, because the police and prisons kill us, the courts and inquests fail us, and politicians, allow it all to happen and then betray us when they're meant to represent us. We're the only ones who are really fighting for justice. I think that we need to have a resurgence of that.
So there's some big and heavy content today, but underneath it all, I think, is this shimmering reminder that just as the threads of violence and repression crisscross the globe, shared by colonial powers and capitalist forces, so too do lines of resistance and dissent. We see families from so-called Australia to Gaza, from Tamil Eelam to Kashmir, from West Papua to Sudan. They know what it is to grieve loved ones lost to state violence. Mothers of those disappeared by repressive state forces come together to organise and strategise for truth and justice, finding common ground from prison waiting rooms to community protests to government offices. There's a whole constellation of people across the globe who will not forget those who have been disappeared, maligned, incarcerated or disbelieved. And as always, our work is to find each other and build a network strong enough to dismantle the regimes of repression bit by bit, place by place, until these empires, like all that came before them, eventually fall. We're going to wrap up this week with one of the speeches from this weekend's protest for Kumanjayi White here in so-called Brisbane, with our dear friend and colleague, Gungari woman and scholar, Dr. Raelene Nixon. This is a profoundly moving and devastating speech in which Raelene shares some of her own family's experiences navigating the coronial inquest into the death in police custody of her beloved son, Stevie Lee Nixon McKellar. We'll be returning to the rest of the speeches from the protest in a future series, but this reminder from Raelene feels too timely. She reminds us that we must take this opportunity to push as hard as we can for the family of Kumanjayi White right now. You've been listening to the Radio Reversal podcast. We're very grateful for your time and interest in listening to these conversations. A reminder, as always, to head to the Substack and subscribe to the podcast if you want to make sure you always get updates on new episodes and get access to our additional write-ups and reflections. You can head to radioreversal.substack.com to join. And a bit of a content warning for this final piece of content from the wonderful Dr. Raelene Nixon, that it does include Raelene's graphic descriptions of the racist police violence that led to the death in custody of her son, Stevie Lee Nixon McKellar. If anything you hear in this episode brings up heavy thoughts or feelings that you need some support processing, we recommend reaching out to Lifeline 13 11 14 for free, confidential counselling support. And if you want to find out how to get involved in ongoing campaigns against Aboriginal deaths in custody and carceral violence more broadly, check out our Substack for links to ongoing campaigns and organisations you can support. Until next time, keep agitating.
My heart is heavy, tears still fall. I feel my spirit ache from the injustice of it all. Police on the front foot, the truth they hide. There is no pride in genocide. A violent altercation is how they describe self-defence as he tried to keep them at arm's length. His life they took no remorse, no compassion, sworn at while beaten with batons. Choke the cunt out, choke him out, they say. Before they knew it, he's lifeless, handcuffed face down. Minutes before they realised he wasn't breathing or making a sound. Aboriginal law, our cultural duty they denied, institutional and structural racism like a badge of honour, they wear it with pride. We wanted to sit with him where he lay, to call our ancestors to guide his way. But we don't want no trouble, is all they say, wanting us to conform to their racist way. An inquiry will be held, the coroner tells us it's not about blame. They'll make recommendations so it doesn't happen again. Sorry for your loss. Sorry for your pain. Yamanana Yelena Dundigu Terrible Yagara. Yamana Naya Manadan Yelena Dundi. Yamananaya Wagger and Mamagan Macha. Hello everyone. I know and respect this is Terrible Yagara land. I know and respect the people of this land, and I know and respect the people of long ago. It's with deep respect that I speak my language on your country. We are gathered on sovereign Aboriginal land that was never ceded to honour the loved ones taken by the violence of a system that was never built to protect us. We protest because justice continually is denied, and silence equals complicity. I'm Raelene Nixon. I'm the granddaughter of Eva Collins from Cherbourg. My parents are Lynette and Norman Nixon. I belong to the Goongerah people of southwest Queensland. My home is on the Maranoa River, where my ancestors walked that land since time immemorial, that is forever. And I know we have an inherent right to live in this country without fear. The poem I shared was written by my sister Sareba for my son Stevie Lee Nixon, who was killed at the hands of Queensland Police in Toowoomba. He was 27 years old. I'm thankful that my sister was able to capture what was happening during a time when I was unable to get perspective, but her words are our truth. They are the echoes of too many lives lost, 36 taken since the Royal Commission, and that is in Queensland alone. That's too many grieving mothers, too many broken families, and too many lies told. Since the Royal Commission, 597 of our people have died in custody. Not one police officer has ever been held criminally accountable. Not one. When you bring those 597 families together, you begin to see the magnitude of this problem. Every name is a life, a story, a son, a daughter, a father, a mother, and a future gone. Today I carry with me the weight of my own loss, my precious son, Stevie Lee. They say it was a violent altercation, and it was. But he was the victim. He was not the perpetrator. First they criminalise us, then they brutalise us, and then they justify it. And it's not just individual officers, it's not just bad apples, it's a system rooted in colonisation, a system that sees our lives as disposable, a system that punishes our grief and polices our mourning. How many more funerals do we have to attend? There has been 12 this year. That's 1/3 of the deaths in custody have been Aboriginal this year alone, and yet we only make up 3% of this population. How many vigils, banners, speeches and FD recommendations do we have to wait for? When we ask for justice, they give us silence or they give us more violence. When we ask for compassion, they treat us like criminals, and when we cry, they call it aggression, and when we speak the truth, they call it confrontation. This state, this country, built on dispossession and maintained through police violence, that should be ashamed. We are the descendants of warriors, we're knowledge holders and cultural protectors, and we come from people who have survived genocide, missions, massacres, prisons, and we are still here. We want accountability, not just recommendations in a report. We want the implementation of those recommendations, not cherry-picked reforms. We want an end to police investigating police, and we demand independent oversight. We demand that police stop the over-policing that's leading to the over-incarceration and ultimate death of our people in their care. We are sick of police and prison guards pursuing, beating, marching and killing our loved ones, and then being protected by a metal badge. This country has to address the inequalities and the traumas perpetrated in this justice system. The system needs to be redesigned to prioritise rehabilitation, care and humanity for God's sake. For our family, the injustice started before the death, when he was pursued, because he was black. The death itself, what happened after the death when they denied us to see him, and then again in the coronial inquest. That coronial inquest invoked more trauma on an already grieving family, where you bear witness to the gross injustice of the police and the state protecting the state. It goes against the purpose of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, which called for every death to be investigated honestly and transparently. Needless to say, we no longer maintain our belief in a system that can and must do better, and we do not trust that the truth will emerge in Stevie Lee's inquest or in any other inquest. We were to give family statements to close the inquest, only to be told moments before taking a stand they had to be changed, and we humbly did. Another copy was circulated and still rejected. I stood up at the end and I said, with all due respect, Your Honour, censoring our family statement defeats the purpose of us giving a family statement. We sat in this courtroom for 4 days and give everybody else the opportunity to speak about what they believed happened to my son. We couldn't be afforded 10 minutes. I sat there and listened to the atrocities that were committed against my sick son. I watched his desperate cries, help me, help me, help me. You got me, you got me, you got me. Did you hear him say you got me? Yes, and they still didn't stop. Get on the fucking ground while simultaneously holding him up. Choke the cunt out. Choke him out. I know. His last words on this earth were, I know. Can you even imagine the fear in that moment that he knew he was about to die? I know. Big love and strength to Kumanjayi White's family and the Yundamu and Alice Springs community and the Walpiri people up there. And actually all the families who are hurting today. We do this not just for those that we've lost, but those who are still here and those who are yet to come. We have a responsibility to our future generations to leave this world in a better place than what we've inherited. Thank Thank you to the organisers. Thank you to the families standing in the crowd. Thank you for showing up. Showing up is the best thing you can do for these families. We are stronger together. And a shout out to Dharug Foundation and Pay the Rest. Support these grassroots organisations. The funds get to the families when they need it. Forever in our hearts, Stevie Lee. Remember his name, Stevie Lee Nixon. Illa Buka Nila Yuri Yuri Yantal Awe. The soul will not die. Peace be with you.